Today's reading is actually words of wisdom or quotes from John Quincy Adams, the 6th President of the United States. And John Quincy Adams was a deeply religious person and one of the first 3 Unitarian presidents, if you count Thomas Jefferson as Unitarian. But he was less interested in theological argument than what religion asked human beings to do. And so I have 2 short quotes that I'm going to give you, and they suggest the practice of spirituality, which is what I wanted to talk about today, is meant to lead to justice and righteousness. So in 1811, he wrote these words to his son, who was named George Washington Adams, by the way. My idea of the Bible as a divine revelation is founded upon its practical use to mankind, and not upon metaphysical subtleties. The Creator must also be the governor of the universe, that his power, his wisdom, and his goodness must be without bounds, that he is a righteous God and loves righteousness, that mankind are bound by his laws of righteousness and accountable to him for their obedience to them. The completion of divine justice must be reserved for another life, he said. And then in the passage from a funeral sermon that Adams preached 200 years ago in 1826, our first concern is to be among the just, to live as we ought and have the excellence that is suitable to the man and the Christian. This way of living is connected to happiness, conscience, and becoming, quote, a blessing to mankind, unquote. So he speaks in language that we don't usually use today, but I did a sermon here 2 weeks ago. It's called Investigate the Founders, and it focused on those 3 presidents, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and John Quincy Adams, because they were the first 3 Unitarian ministers, or presidents of the United States. And it talked about how their ideology, their Unitarianism, had influenced the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and, frankly, our form of government. But as I said then, when I got to John Quincy Adams, he was the one I didn't know much about before I did the research. And it struck me that he was part of a younger generation that was shifting Unitarianism from kind of a stuffy church, stuffy religious organization, although it was liberally religious, right? But brought it into the how do we deal with it in every day? And it was kind of the beginning of movement towards social justice being such a big part of what Unitarian Universalists do today. So that was what made me think about this sermon, and I always thought that Unitarian Universalists struggle with the concept of spirituality. So this is what I created out of those 2 things. Because when most people hear the word justice, they usually think of politics. They think of elections like the one we just had. They think of protests, legislation, court cases, or nowadays social media debates. Justice becomes something that's kind of happening out there in the public square. It's something organizations pursue, governments administer, and activists advocate. And then when most people hear the word spirituality, they think of something quite different than that. They think of meditation, prayer, nature, mindfulness, peace. It's always something quiet, something inward. In fact, I think our culture has trained us to separate these 2 words, as if justice belongs in the streets while spirituality belongs on a meditation cushion somewhere. And I wonder, as I was writing this, if that's one of the greatest misunderstandings of our time. What if justice is not merely a political commitment? What if justice is one of the deepest spiritual practices we can undertake? So that's where John Quincy Adams came into. Nearly 200 years ago, John Quincy Adams reflected on religion in a way that feels very modern. From the quote I said earlier, my idea of the Bible as a divine revelation is founded upon its practical use to mankind and not upon metaphysical subtleties. That is a very remarkable statement for that time. Because if you knew anything in Unitarian churches back then, the minister would drone on for hours on end about some sort of metaphysical subtlety. And so thank you, we don't have to do that today. But the fact that he thought that it needed to be useful was remarkable. He wasn't dismissing theology. He was simply saying that religion isn't primarily about winning arguments over doctrine. Religion should make us better human beings. It's as simple as that. Its truth is measured by its fruits. So think about these. Does religion make us more compassionate? Does it make us more courageous or honest? Or does it make us more willing to stand with those who suffer? If not, then what exactly is it doing? And for Adams, religion was practical, and its purpose was transformation. He talks a lot about that. Now that sounds strikingly familiar to Unitarian Universalism in the 21st century. Frankly, you all know this. We are not asked to believe exactly the same things. In fact, we are all quite independent and very happy to believe something different than your neighbor. But we're invited to become certain kinds of people. Our shared values don't ask us to memorize doctrines or Bible verses, but they ask us to cultivate lives of love, generosity, equity, pluralism, and justice. Those are 5 of the 6 values. And justice isn't simply something we should support. Justice is something we practice. So there was a contemporary of John Quincy Adams, Theodore Parker. I'm sure you've heard of him. Another UU minister, or Unitarian minister. The other U wasn't there yet. Theodore Parker understood this. Many of you know his famous words. Maybe you didn't know his name that went with it. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Martin Luther King Jr. probably is the one that made those words most famous, but they were actually used by Abraham Lincoln before that and Barack Obama since then. Now, Parker's full statement is even richer. He said, I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, but from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. So think about what Parker doesn't say in there. He doesn't say justice is inevitable. He doesn't say history automatically gets better. He doesn't say, yeah, you can sit back and just watch the progress unfold. Instead, Parker expresses faith. And these are very strong faith statements. Faith that love is always stronger than hatred. Faith that truth ultimately outlasts deception. And faith that justice is woven into the fabric of reality itself. But that faith requires partners. Think about it. That arc bends because millions of ordinary people bend with it. Give it a little nudge. So what is justice? Let's talk about that for a second. It's a little nuanced. Justice is simply not just changing the world. That's a nice goal. But justice is also allowing the work of changing the world to change us at the same time. And that's the spiritual practice part of social justice. Every spiritual tradition has practices that shape the soul, if you want to call it that. Meditation trains attention. Prayer trains humility. Gratitude trains joy. Forgiveness trains compassion. And justice trains love. Justice teaches us to see people whose lives are different from our own. Justice teaches us to interrupt our own assumptions and implicit biases. Justice stretches the boundaries of who we consider our people. Think about this. Every time we ask, whose voice is missing here, we're practicing justice. Or every time we refuse to dehumanize someone we disagree with, we are practicing justice. Every time we choose curiosity over contempt, we're practicing justice. And this is important because justice is often misunderstood. Some imagine justice as always being angry. Think of that fist in the air in protests, and people are just angry and they want to, get rid of the patriarchy and everything that is and create anarchy. So they think of justice as angry, but then others imagine justice means always being certain, knowing exactly what is right and what is wrong. But spiritual justice, which is what we're talking about today, asks something much harder. It asks us to remain open, to keep learning, to remain humble enough to admit that tomorrow we may understand something that we can't see yet today. Justice without humility becomes self-righteousness. And humility without justice becomes complacency. So you actually do need both humility and justice. So a great example, if you go back to John Quincy Adams, he spent the last decades of his life fighting slavery in Congress. He was a big orator against slavery. At that point, he wasn't young. He wasn't trying to build a political career. For heaven's sakes, he'd already been president, and he went back to be a congressman. He had nothing left to prove. Yet he devoted himself to defending people whose freedom most Americans were willing to ignore at the time. And why? Because his Unitarian spirituality would not allow him to separate faith from justice. He believed humanity was accountable to what he called the laws of righteousness. He kind of thought that there was this architect of the universe, and justice and righteousness were interchangeable words for him. And he thought that it was just built right into the universe. So whether or not we use his theological language today, the underlying question remains, what kind of people are we becoming? Every act of justice helps answer that question. So you don't have to march in every protest to practice justice. You don't even have to become a policy expert. Justice at its core is much, much closer to home. Think about this. It begins with listening deeply, really learning someone's story. Standing beside a friend who is being excluded. Speaking up when a cruel joke is being passed around. Welcoming the newcomer. Showing up when somebody's grieving. Voting. Volunteering. Sharing what we have. And changing our minds, being able to be flexible and change our minds when new understanding arrives. So I think you get the point here. Justice is built from thousands of ordinary decisions, basically how you live your life. A lot of young adults today describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious. And I think that's because religion seems to have become disconnected from real life. Too much doctrine, too little compassion, too much certainty, not enough curiosity. So here's the money phrase. Imagine a spirituality that's measured not by how many hours you meditate, but how many people experience greater dignity because you are alive. I'll repeat that. Imagine a spirituality measured not by how many hours we meditate, but by how many people experience greater dignity because we are alive. Imagine prayer becoming courage, or worship becoming generosity, or faith becoming solidarity. And that's the kind of spirituality that's really difficult to dismiss because it changes lives. So the title of my sermon today, my message today was, what does spirituality mean to Unitarian Universalists? So here's my answer. Our faith speaks of love at the center. Love isn't merely an emotion. Love is a way of organizing our lives. This is a quote that's been repeated over and over. I don't know where the original source is, but it's justice is simply what love looks like in public. Justice is love refusing to remain private. Justice is compassion that gets up out of the chair on Sunday morning and walks into the neighborhood. Justice is kindness with courage. So perhaps Parker's famous image needs one small addition. The arc of the moral universe may indeed bend towards justice, but only because generation after generation chooses to place their hands upon it. Not perfectly, by any stretch, not all at once, not without mistakes, but faithfully. Every act of welcome, every difficult conversation, every apology, every vote, every meal served, every child protected, every stranger treated as a neighbor. They're not interruptions to your spiritual life. They are the spiritual life. So I'm going to close with just, I guess it's a blessing. May we become the people whose spirituality is measured, not only by what we believe, but by whom we help flourish. May our meditation deepen our compassion. May our worship strengthen our courage. May our curiosity make us more humble, and may our love become justice. And may our practice of justice shape not only a better world, but better souls. Amen.